that means that they would have a significant portion of the readers within the country. And what would happen at the point where the sale is going on? We say that at the point where this one entity would own over 50% of companies that together make up this 30% of national readership, we would break them up. And if they fail to comply, we will have heavy fines. We will do everything legally possible to try to break them up. Any clarifications on the model? No? So first of all, we say that the interests of private equity firms and single media companies are very pernicious. Why is this? First of all, regarding private equity firms, we say that the way private equity firms often work is that they try to streamline processes and to make them as effective as possible without thinking about things like their employers or employees and things like their ethics or what these companies represent. In general, how equity firms work is that they look through the staff of a company and see who can be made redundant, what can be outsourced, and in general, how to make things easier. We say that what happens then is that these companies are often stripped to the degree that they are shells of their former selves, and they may be somewhat more profitable, but in general, they lose their ability to make news in as beneficial of a way when they lose a lot of their staff and so forth. We say that in addition, single media companies are also very pernicious. Note that often individual media companies are owned by billionaires and lots of families that have a lot of control and around the country. So we say that at the point where they consolidate these newspapers and they are part of this larger media company, there is a disability to criticize, first of all, these owners, but also other companies within this umbrella. So other media companies that may be doing predatory things or other kind of entertainment that is going on that is negative. So we say that in general, these interests are pernicious, specifically for the entities that tend to be doing this consolidation. But why then do we think that on our side, the watchdog function of the media is better performed than on their side? We think that the comparative is between smaller newspapers having to compete against other newspapers that are not owned by the same institution versus them being owned by the same entity, but staying in their niche and trying not to attack each other, not criticizing each other, and not trying to criticize their owners. So why do we think this watchdog function happens better on our side? We say that this happens through a multitude of ways. First of all, we think that the editors that are likely to be editing the newspapers on our side are likely to be more diverse. That is to say that because they belong to different companies, there's likely to be different interests that select who will be the editor. So there's likely to be more liberal interests, there's likely to be more conservative interests, there's likely to be regional interests, and this is how the editors are chosen. In these large consolidated firms, we think that the choice of editor, which is very crucial, is likely to be from the perspective of who is likely to support our financial interests, who is likely to follow the company line in general, while still towing the niche that we have determined is appropriate for this newspaper. So specifically, we say that when there are many newspapers that are owned by a single company, the way they will want to operate them is to ensure that none of these newspapers eat the market share of any other. So they will very directly say that, okay, you are the newspaper that focuses on liberal issues in this region. You are the one who focuses on these issues in these region, without wanting them to compete against each other so that there isn't this redundancy and so that it's economically more efficient. We think that what happens then is that newspapers are less likely to call out each other, but also less likely to try to compete for the same stories. So what does this look like? We think it means that there would be less newspapers specifically focusing on a specific kind of topic. So for example, in a regional election, there would be less newspapers that would be trying to cover one specific story, but rather kind of deciding who will be the ones who run the story, etc. But we also say that when there are smaller companies, that they will have a better ability to decide about their resources. So at the point where you are a part of this big organization that is top down telling you what to do, we think that you have less of an ability to make decisions because the kind of company direction is coming from above. Whereas when you are within your smaller entity, you're able to decide how you exactly use resources. I'll take OO now.
You understand that we're still going to have other media, we're still going to have TV stations, independent web portals who can still address these kind of things you're talking about?
We think that for newspapers, it is particularly important because note that traditional media companies that are not newspapers are heavily moving towards entertainment. So basically making entertainment that is becoming easier to consume and more video based and so forth. And they do not try to do the kind of things that newspapers do, which is specifically hard-hitting journalism that is specifically, for example, trying to cover regional issues rather than, for example, national issues, which are covered on television and so forth. So we say that newspapers have a particularly strong role, both regionally, but also in more in-depth issues like hard-hitting political analysis and so forth. But we do say that, so we say that specifically due to the fact that smaller newspapers will have to compete against each other, they're likely to create better news. And we think that they will be likely to survive. Why do we think this is the case? We think that they are, due to the fact that they have more competition rather than being protected by some degree by this big consolidated entity, they will try more innovative things, like, for example, new revenue models, for example, having more ads and so forth, and trying to reach new target groups that they think would be interested in their media and trying to push harder for innovative stories and so forth. We say that at this point, they're most likely to keep big institutions account, whereas on their side, we think that they're unlikely to keep to account the people who own this company, the people who within this company are doing pernicious things, therefore proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the speaker very much for their speech, and I'm happy to call upon the Leader of Opposition. Here.
Hi, just to check, can you hear me okay? Great, in a moment. Okay, I will start now. Okay, so first a bit of rebuttal to opening government. Okay, so opening government tells us that equity firms are focused on profit and they will do everything possible to get that and compromise the media. Like, I don't see how this is comparative, because if we have media that are owned by smaller companies, they have their investors, they have their owners. When someone invest in printing presses and in advertising, or even if it's on a lower level, they still expect a return. People don't own media as a humanitarian thing. And even if they would, that would not be comparative. They would be able to have some media on this side. So this is not simply something that does not change. Okay, another thing I want to clear out is, how do these equity firms function? Like, they don't control everything that you do. That would not be profitable for them, for the sole reason, because if their board of directors does not have the specific knowledge how to run every media company, they are likely to try to influence things about your work policy if they believe that you're not profitable. But if you're not profitable either way, you will simply go bankrupt. But they will not change your editors. They will not be bothered. They will not talk on their board meetings about who wrote what story and so on. This is not simply, that's not how this works. If you function okay and if you report stories, that will be okay for them. Okay, so OG tells us that the print media is the crucial actor here, that they are almost going extinct and so on, and this is completely bad. We agree with this. Like, a lot less people are reading print media. Like, they mostly get their news online, where it is easy to access and it doesn't cost anything. So the people that buy the news are actually now it's a lot smaller group of people. Okay, which means that we need to be that the print media needs to be more efficient in its use of resources, and this is where it becomes important that one company has multiple media under their control, because then they can actually capitalize on some unique benefits, like using the economy of scale for production of things, for printing and so on, like having the negotiating power, like more negotiating power when actually like trying to get good prices for ad placement and so on, like things like that. Also, like giving these newspapers like encouraging them to work together. Like, there is a lot more intermedia cooperation on this side when they're owned by the same entity, where they're more inclined to actually like work together, because they are not cutting into each other's profit and so on. So this is like a lot better. actually on our side, and we believe that this is crucial. The real comparative here is investigative journalism, because that's the one thing that you have a lot more of in print media than you have in online media, because online media, which in a large part replaced print media, is more focused on frequency, sensationalism, because the algorithms force them to be that. They want cheap stories so they can make like more of them and so on, which means that long investigations that might not lead to anything are not necessarily profitable if you're an online newspaper. But if you're like a regular, if you're like one of those well-established newspaper where you know that if you break an important story, like a certain set of people will be more inclined to actually like not only buy your newspaper but subscribe to it, even if it costs a little bit more of money and so on. And this is why it is in their interest to actually go for this, to fund these longer investigations where they go into important topics, whether it is politicians or people in the business sector and so on. And this is possible. And for all of this to work, they need to be consolidated. At least some of them need to be consolidated together a bit later if I have the time, because then they can actually use these unique benefits. Then they can work together. Then they can trade information, because if everyone is working for themselves, they're not likely to trade information and so on. Like, and even the point of OG is actually on our side when they say that they won't do the same stories. Like, that's not true. If you have like a lot of media that has no communication, that is completely independent, they're more likely to spend the time on the same stories. But now if they can like coordinate together within the same entity, they're more likely to do that. Also, this is necessary for local media, because the economy of scale that we talked about is the only thing that can actually help the local media survive, because it cannot do that on their own, because the past time where everyone in a town would buy the same newspaper is over. So they need the economy of scale. They need to produce things together. They can't have their own paper mills and so on. Well, and this is necessary, like, because because in our world there are still some local newspapers that survive, that produce stories about the community, stories that would not be interested on a national level but might be really crucial on a local level. And this is far more likely because we're in a realistic capitalistic system, and this is how things work, whether that is good. Okay, another thing, like when talking about the way biases work in media and the abuse of power, like it might be intuitive to think like big corporations, they must be evil, they must be like very bad, and the small newspapers are like very good and moral, but they also serve a profit motive. But I'm going to give you like the incentives that lead to having less bias if you have this consolidation. The thing is, when you have like this very big entity that owns a lot of equity everywhere, they have like their own brand, they have their own massive PR that far surpasses only newspapers, that goes into other interests and so on. They are far less likely to allow these newspapers to allow any of the newspapers that they own to partake in toxic or completely biased behavior. And there are multiple reasons for this. First, it's easier to find out when you have like this. If a massive entity was trying to influence a certain bias with the newspapers, like there would be there would be a lot more data to analyze, so some independent journalists could find out. Secondly, there's a lot more chance of having people leak information about that, because you have a lot more people. And why they would not do that, even if in the short run it was profitable for some of their papers? Because the PR hit would be very bad, because it will not only affect the paper. If a paper is very toxic, if they lie and so on, like that would other papers somewhere would write about that, or blogs or whatever would write about that, and that would be able to affect other things, like affect their PR, affect their stock, and the way the public actually like perceives them, which is quite damaging. Thank you.
I thank the speaker very much for their speech, and I'm happy to call upon the Deputy Prime Minister. Hear, hear.
Okay, 3, 2, 1. So in this speech, I'll talk about how the incentives of private equity firms and big media companies differ from the interests of small companies, and why that means that we'll have less local news, lower quality news, and like less of a watchdog function for the newspapers and for power in general. So firstly, on the incentives of private equity and big media companies, OO tells us that the owners of small media companies also are profit seeking, and that private equity firms wouldn't control everything in like a newspaper anyway. But they don't really characterize what are the incentives of private equity firms, for one thing. So we tell you that private equity firms maximize profits in the short run and then are likely to shut down the entire firm, because the whole point of a private equity firm is that you're making a return on investment. And this is what they do. They often buy distressed assets very cheaply, like for example, many struggling local newspapers. And then they like have this very short-term business model. Like for example, they raise the prices for elderly subscribers while at the same time laying off their writing staff. So they know that elderly subscribers are like, they've been subscribing their entire life, they're unlikely to unsubscribe, and they might be like suffering from dementia, not at their sharpest, so that these subscribers will continue to buy this newspaper even if the quality of the newspaper is very bad. And they know that this is not a sustainable business model, but the point is to make a return on investment and to shut down the newspaper once that return on investment has been achieved. And if you compare this to the small media companies, yes, they want to make a profit, but they're in it for the long run. They want to stay in business because this is like the only business that they have and it's their career. And they're the ones who have kind of personally maybe hired the editors and the writing staff, and it's not easy for them to change to a whole different industry. So we think that they'll have a more long-term approach, and a more long-term business approach means that you write better quality articles and you try to compete on quality as opposed to just kind of ripping off your customers. And then I think that like the big media companies also have an incentive to maximize efficiency in a different way than small media companies. So as my partner mentioned, they don't want competition between their different newspapers. So for example, they're likely to buy up kind of a lot of the local newspapers and replace that with a more bigger, or like a newspaper for a larger region. And again, that means that we don't, because again, like it's kind of the same analysis. They have many kinds of newspapers going on and they're not dependent on the survival of this one local or smaller newspaper. So they're going to just like buy it up and get its customers and replace it with a bigger newspaper. And that means we have less local news. And why is that a bad thing? Because like local news is something that affects your daily life quite a lot. And for example, if you want to know about the local infrastructure projects that are happening in your community and that they've been built very badly, this is something that's very unlikely for someone like the New York Times to write about. And you rely on the local journalists to hold your like local power to account and to make sure that things in your local community, that like your local money is not being squandered, for example. Like for example, in Finland, some schools in one particular city spent a ton of money buying like computers, and then those were basically wasted because like they did that purchase in a bad way. So this is the type of thing that's important to keep, and that local news and small businesses uniquely are able to do. And yeah, on the other hand, we think that like news networks on TV have already been consolidated to a large extent, because like the TV industry is even in bigger trouble than the news industry. So we don't think that there's really an alternative to the local newspaper. And the TV industry is obviously in trouble because of streaming services like Netflix. So then moving on to the watchdog function. So opening opposition tells us that big companies have an incentive to do investigative reporting, and that they also have the means to do so. But first I'll take a POI from closing. Okay, opening.
How do all of those benefits of local newspaper exist if you yourself claim that they're going to die?
They're not willing to die. So we say that they're trying to, like, yes, they are trying to stay in business, but do you mean like, why would they sell off to the equity firm? Well, that's because the equity firm might make like a pretty nice offer for them, or the big company like might make a big offer. And, you know, like even the local smaller newspapers are owned by shareholders or maybe a family or something. And it's very likely that that family will kind of have some of them will want to make money and profit, and therefore they'll be willing to sell. But we think that in general, if they remain in business, they will do so with the kind of intention of staying in business. And as for the watchdog function, so OO tells us that big companies have the incentive to do investigative reporting, and they can also use economies of scale like trading information, but they don't really tell us how investigative reporting works. It actually doesn't need that many resources. So often it's done in small teams. So for example, the stuff on Harvey Weinstein was found out by like 1 or 2 investigative reporters. And often it's based on tips. So you just basically get a call from someone you know, and then you hear what would be a good thing to report. So I think that those tips don't really depend on you having a large news network organization. If you give a tip, you only need one person to give that tip to, and that person can do the reporting. And if they fail, you can give that tip to another person. So I don't see how big companies change this. Also, we say that like big company, there's an almost infinite amount of topics that can be investigated. So it's unlikely that small companies would do overlapping work, especially because they're likely to get different kinds of tips from different kinds of people. And then also we say that big companies often have ties to politicians and other power players in society. Like for example, Amazon, which now owns Business Insider and Washington Post, obviously has clear links to Jeff Bezos, and like is very much interested, who in turn is very much interested in things like regulation towards Amazon and big tech. So at the point where big companies own a lot of newspapers, it is likely that their main owners would exert some kind of pressure on the editorial team to not write about things that in a way that is unfavorable to the interests of those owners. And that's why we think we get a less of a government watchdog function. And as I explained, like the other alternatives to newspapers are unlikely to take care of this function as well, because other media like mix entertainment with news and is often kind of not as accessible. And especially older people read a lot more newspapers, and they're also more likely to vote. And at the point where these older people kind of don't have access to a lot of different news or biased news, then that impacts society. Proud to propose.
I thank the speaker very much for their speech, and I'm happy to call upon the Deputy Leader of Opposition. Here.
Am I audible?
Mm-hmm.
Am I audible? I didn't see the confirmation. Okay, great. Just to get my stopwatch. Open government gives us 3 claims. Firstly, this is going to destroy local media because they're going to stop existing, because they're going to be bundled up in huger medias. Note what is the comparative. They began their speech that they said that these medias are struggling, that they can be bought dirt cheap because they can't cover their cost. Why is that? Because the cost for the media that is the largest is the operational cost. Printing, distribution, like having a person who's going to manage things, person who's going to manage marketing, person who's going to manage like public relations, person who's going to work on a front desk, etc. Know that these things, when then put in a bundled up with multiple companies, can be scaled, that all, for example, local newspapers in a single US state can operate with a single, like a few agents who are going to coordinate all marketing for them, going to have managers who are going to coordinate them from one space, that we can outsource these kind of things, that we can have like single printing press who is going to do single distribution for the whole state, etc. But they're going to say, they are going to actually do this because they're going to bundle up in a single newspaper. Note what is the comparative, that these are going to die out. I'm going to still explain to you why they're still going to exist. They tell you themselves that you don't need a lot of journalists to write stories, to do investigative journalism. Especially, for example, the story about computers in Finland. A local newspaper can do it with three or four news writers. Why is this important? Because then the only thing that this newspaper itself needs to endure, or the cost that it needs to endure, is the cost of paying for those writers. In our world, we are much more likely to have more of them, especially because they cater for a characteristic market. They're going to be sold in their local town, for example, 10, 20, 50,000 people, which means that they're going to manage to gather a huge amount of revenue now because they are going to have these huge overhead costs that I talked about. And they can still cater to their needs. They can still talk about local issues, things that are happening in the town, offer news for them, etc. Equity companies still intended to do that because they're going to generate revenue. They're still going to, not a lot, but when you have, for example, in 15 cities, people who generate money, and you don't have huge amount of costs because of the explained there are no huge costs, they're still going to provide profit, which means that they have incentive to exist. Even if they, for example, I'm not sure why, choose to put money, their managing costs, consulting costs, who are much larger than they can get from stripping off these kinds of things, or that they're going to, I'm not really sure how profitable business model is to sell newspaper to send out people. I mean, they're not probably the majority of the market. So this means that they still have a lot of incentive actually to do this, especially why they're not going to engage in these predatory consumer manipulation practices is because this is extremely bad PR. This is something that could probably cause investigation by the government. This is something that could probably cause a scandal, which is probably going to, firstly, damage their public image if they don't want to do so. Secondly, this is probably going to impact their stock. And thirdly, if this is happening often enough, local newspapers aren't going to be willing to be sold to them because people who own them probably own them and operate them because they believe that they are providing value to their society, to their local community, which means that probably they don't want to engage with these kind of companies. They would rather die out than cooperate with the monster. So we believe that this is not, that this goes on our side. Secondly, they tell us that it's going to be owned by influential people who are going to do predatory things. For example, they're not going to attack Jeff Bezos. Know that they're still going to allow, for example, they're going to trigger this model if there is only 30% of the market, which probably means that we're still going to be able to have some kind of diversification of the market. There's still going to be newspapers in the other 70% who are going to be willing to do so. Why? Because these are big hitting stories. These are the stories who sell newspaper, who build prestige, who build subscriptions, etc. This means that there are going to be other companies, other platforms, independent journalists on the internet, etc., who are going to be willing to do this. We're still going to have this, especially because we have other forms of media. We're still going to have TV stations who want to report on this because, again, this is going to increase rating, increase prestige, increase their trustworthiness, etc. So that means that we're still going to have that watchdog function. I already explained to you why we're going to have watchdog function in the local value level because it's cheap and it's already existing. Their third point is how this is going to create diverse actors. Note that that's not true. They're going to buy newspapers, and usually newspapers in the status quo are going to already cater to a certain kind of market. They probably, when they buy those kind of newspapers, want to hold that market. What does that mean? That means that you have newspapers like Guardian who pander to the left-wing, more liberal people, and you have the Independent who pander to the right-wing, conservative people. This means that they're still already specialized, even if though we don't have this kind of mechanism, which means that probably we're still going to have it. They're going to not intervene in each other's issue. I'm not really sure what this actually means. If there is a huge question, which is of national matter, national newspapers are all going to write about it because they all have different perspectives, just because of these different editorial policies, etc. And the local media themselves don't engage in this kind of questions. So we believe that we're still going to have plurality of opinions, plurality of ideas, because there are still incentive to have diverse market who are going to cater to diverse amount of people, because we want to read the newspapers because of our confirmation bias who pander to our own beliefs, which means that in the both worlds, the market incentives for those kind of newspapers are the same. So that means that probably we're still, not probably, but surely we're going to have it in both sides of the house. I'm going to take closing if they want to engage with us.
Yes. Can you please explain to us why a big media organization would have an incentive to actually report on things that contradict their owner's incentive and why they're good?
I think Novak told you about this. Firstly, if they want to keep this thing as an asset, and they want to keep it as an asset, for example, huge newspapers who have huge amount of prestige, and destroying them would be rather horrendous. And huge newspapers do this kind of New York Times, Globe, etc., Guardian. They don't want to do this because this can be easily found out. Why? Novak gave you multiple reasons. Firstly, there's a lot more accountability now because people are they're going to be much more close looked at. Secondly, there's people inside can leak this kind of information, which means that they're probably going to be seen. And thirdly, there is much more public interest in the cells, so public themselves can notice these kind of things. If other newspapers, because I really doubt that most of these people are going to actually control most of it, that the single person is going to control most of it, that they're still going to be able to tell it about it, especially the news, the TV stations can also do it. But why they aren't going to do it even if they could is firstly, they don't want the PR disaster of it when it's going to be found out. Their stocks are going to lose value, they're going to be investigated, perception of them is going to be much worse, and value of this media is going to decline, which means that they're themselves destroying these assets. Even if this is true, note, I'm not rather sure how comparative it is. If, for example, some media finds about a horrible story about Jeff Bezos, they're not going to come out if they're independent because they know that Jeff Bezos can destroy them. But if they know that they have backing of a huge company who has profit incentive to have a newspaper who's in the headlines, who broke the major story, which increases its value, its prestige, its subscribers are going to back it, going to finance these kind of lawsuits if they happen, etc. This means that we have more incentive and more power to actually engage with these kind of stories because now we have a much stronger backing. If my survivability is dependent on me not getting attacked by Jeff Bezos and me having a hedge fund which is going to protect me because I'm making money for them, I believe I'm much more likely to engage in these stories when I have protection of hedge funds. Because of all of these reasons, we are very proud to oppose.
Thank the speaker very much for their speech and the entire top half of the debate. And I'm happy to call upon the member of government, but if you could just hold 1 second, I need to get a charger for my phone because I am irresponsible.
Am I audible? Okay. Give me a thumbs up if we're ready. So I'm starting in 3, 2, 1. Panel, there was a viral story not too long ago about many media outlets in the US that showed the exact same reporting, and all the narrators said the exact same thing, which seemed like a very scary brainwash. This is not a story. This is not a movie. This is reality. It happens in media, but more importantly, it happens in the internet. And this is the thing that we need to change in our world. 3 points from CG. 1, why when the media body is big, they have too much power to push dangerous agenda. 2, once they're big, they don't have the incentive to actually report on important things, scandalous things, which change reality for the best. And thirdly, why on the comparative we'll get more media outlets. 1 point of rebuttal, everything is engaging, and will be very clearly why it's more important in the first half. First of all, regarding the fact that it's very easy to find out when somebody does that. This is absurd. 1, they are huge bodies. Have you seen Condé Nast? Have you seen the big corporations? They are composed of hundreds of companies with very different bureaucratical links. It's very difficult to link one newspaper to one media company. It's extremely complicated. We don't understand why it's likely. Secondly, people don't investigate that. Users are usually just reading stuff and do not go and investigate deeply. But thirdly, we don't have the actual power to investigate that because, as we told you, most people and most of the high power of media outlets is within big bodies that do not have the right incentives to investigate, and this is what we want to change. Now, let's get into the constructive. First of all, why big media outlets are afraid of actually reporting on things that are important for us. It's crucial to understand what we're talking about, okay? So we agree with the characterization of OG that, I mean, their owners are very rich, etc. But what are they not reporting? What we're missing? We're missing reports about lobbyism. We're missing reports about scandalous activities of companies taking, taxes offshore and doing things that corrupt society and taking money away from the country. We're talking about just things that are explosive and very, and very difficult to talk about, like LGTB, like immigration and stuff like that. And discussing very deep matters about things that are happening. We said that it doesn't happen status quo. They report on that for a few mechanisms which never got on first half. A, because they have a base which they're afraid to go against. You need to understand that mostly because they want advertising and because they want to appeal to the vast majority of people, they would usually go with the majority in their specific country. That means that they are going to go for the things that they cater for their needs, and not for the things that usually cater for minorities. Now, it's crucial to understand that even if they say in OO that yeah, but they want traffic because of controversial stories are very short term. It goes when the controversy starts, but goes away at the long term when your base is angry at you for reporting that and are painting you in bad lighting. But more than that, we need to understand that the stock owners don't want this type of zigzag. We'd say that even if they see, they prefer a 2% increase for their stock hold every year, and don't see like a drop because of a bad story that annoys the base. Now, crucially, what happens? What's the damage? Because as we told you, they control the vast majority of outlets. Also local media, not only newspapers, but particularly the debate is mostly about internet. Now, crucially, when you don't report on these scandalous things, what happens? People are not voting properly because they're not aware of these things. It's noticed that local media is the most trustworthy media for most people. When they don't get the reporting there, they usually are not exposed to that at all, so they're not voting properly. Secondly, they're not taking lobbyists and companies accountable when they're doing things that are eventually infringing on their rights. So it's crucial what we're losing basically if you have a law about corporate tax. If it's going to be 10% or 15%, eventually, when you don't see that some of these things are pushed by lobbyists and that the incentives are not proper, and this is not being reported properly, and again, because they're incentives of these corporations, they're big, and they're usually part of mega corporates of people that have a very big incentive for things like offshore tax evasions and of a lower corporate tax. These are things that we're losing. But crucially, more than that, they have the ability to create a smokescreen. What does that mean? Because they control such a vast majority of outlets, they can make a portrayal of a debate. They can show different opinions, but very slightly. They could make the different outlets like argue between 10% to 15% and not 30%. They can try to create a discussion on very minimal changes, but not crucial things that actually change reality. And this is crucial because this smokescreen is actually infringing on people's ability to change reality. But more than that, let's get more concrete than that, because eventually what we're talking about, what kind of so this is about the agenda that they're pushing and losing, but more than that, about the comparative, because they're saying about outlets and why the fact that these outlets are going to disappear. On the comparative, we're actually on our side, we have more outlets, more diversity. Why? Because first of all, economy of scale is not inherent to big corporations. Why? Because you have many external bodies that do this kind of economy of scale for you. Big businesses that actually build sites for thousands of businesses. You don't need to do it in-house. Big businesses that print for thousands of businesses. You don't need it in-house. You don't need to do any of this in-house. Now, so basically, there's no inherent benefit to that. Secondly, they say about like cooperation. You also do it in status quo. You can cooperate within different. You can take a big story and divide that to different type of bodies, even if they're not under the same ownership, because they have an incentive to cooperate, and each person gets a certain story done, and eventually they combine the pieces into one huge story. So obviously they still have that. Now, thirdly, when you say that, we say that the business model today, is not requiring big corporates. It's true that they currently control them, but however, in our case, we don't think that it's crucial for that to happen. Why? A, because we think that eventually the business model is mostly advertising. These are things that are very accessible also for medium-sized companies. It's not things that are actually required to be a huge corporate that actually control this type of advertising. We say that eventually, when you come to this type of when you come to this kind of cost, most of the share costs are not there. Okay. Also, the share cost of like getting editors, getting a website, etc., in the area of internet are very low. Obviously, you can do it if you're a single person, but if you're a small company or medium-sized company, you're still able to do so. Now, notice the reason they're not going for these companies is because these companies are very sharp. Are very predatory. They're buying them with big chunks of money because they want to gain so much power and influence. But on the comparative, it's much better on our side of the house if we force them to be under the ownership of multiple companies, because eventually it still allows them much of the economy of scale, if not all of it, and also it allows them because the smaller you are, you have less. You're less dependent on stockholders or on people that are eventually part of the billionaires in society and are able to push an agenda that is usually against the vast majority of the nation and is benefiting only the most elite 1%, but B, just more ability to actually cater for your own needs and actually report on things that are scandalous without somebody holding you back. And this is the reason that you need to propose this motion. Thank you.
I thank the speaker very much for their speech, and I'm happy to call upon the member of opposition. Hear, hear.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Starting in 3, 2, 1. The problem with government bench in this debate is it is almost entirely uncomparative. I'm going to do a couple of things in this speech. One, I'm going to explain why the stuff on accountability is basically a wash because it's all uncomparative anyway. Two, we're going to talk about in our extension the harms of competition between small firms, not only in terms of worsening the quality of news that happens to be produced in the country, but secondly also in terms of the ability of other actors to be able to influence news within that nation and how it creates a market for things like Russian interference in foreign elections. Why is it uncomparative? Look, small companies are also unlikely to criticize corporations in the way that they say they are going to. I mean, note that they never say that they are going to or justify why it is something that is likely to happen in the first place. So I don't think you should credit them with a win on this anyway. But look, when small companies rely on ad revenue when they exist on social media in general in the future, like take The Guardian. The Guardian was unable to sustain itself on donations of people who were reading the newspaper and had to start introducing adverts into its revenue stream. The problem you rely on corporations of potential future investors or future people who are going to buy adverts for you. To the extent that you choose to criticize lots of corporations, I think the corporations who would potentially advertise with you are just less willing to fund you in the first place because they feel like they're not necessarily safe from that criticism themselves in the long run. And therefore unclear why they have an incentive to continually criticize these corporations in the long run, given that they do rely on them to be able to exist in the first place. And I think because of that, this is why this debate is so far quite uncomparative. So let's talk about the harms of competition between small firms, because I think to some degree we accept open governance comparative. We accept the fact that print media is probably dying in this debate, probably looks like a lot of like different media companies existing on social media attempting to continue existing in the long run. We accept that their revenue is probably not based on sales, but rather is based on ad views in the first place. So getting people to click on your articles means that you can make money because people view the ads and companies will pay you to put adverts onto your social media places in the first place. The first problem with this is it worsens the quality of news in general, because the way that you get people to click on your articles in the first place is by having sensational news headlines such that people choose to click on your news article as opposed to choosing to click on someone else's news article. That is, that newspaper companies are more and more encouraged to produce things like clickbait news where they have sensationalized headlines or have extreme views being fronted in their articles such that they provoke an extreme response in people, such that they choose to stop scrolling down their screen, stop scrolling down their Facebook newsfeed, and instead choose to click on that article and view the ads that are on that article. The problem with this is twofold. The first is to say that not everybody does click on these headlines. So when you're constantly scrolling down Facebook and you read headlines, but you don't click on those articles, then it's very hard for you to be able to dissect the fact that these are sensationalized in the first place, meaning that people in general have much more polarized views of how politics works in their country because they are constantly being exposed to sensationalized narratives in a way that, and their views become informed by over-exaggerated headlines to begin with. But I think the second thing to say is the general quality of discourse generally breaks down. Like, I think there becomes an incentive to drive people towards having extreme emotional responses to things, to get them to click on things in the first place and stop looking at their friends' pictures. I think that means that you have to make people care much more deeply about issues, but it's very hard to take a moderate position on issues when that is the case, because I don't know why people are incredibly engaged in moderate political analysis, but rather if you say Trump is the worst person ever, then people are much more likely to have an emotional response and want to click on that in the first place. But I think that means that you're less able to have boring political analysis within your articles in the first place, because you have to compete with all of these other firms who are producing more exciting content than you, or producing more sensational content than you, that are catching more people's eyes and getting them to click on them. The problem with that is, in general, that you have less good quality of political discourse or political analysis within news articles in the first place. Look, news isn't just good in abstract. News matters because it informs people's votes and it informs people's ability to self-determine their lives or to vote for a government like they support in the first place. I think insofar as you have less understanding of these things because the general quality of discourse within news is worse, then that is clearly a harm that we shouldn't support. The comparative here then is when you have less competition because single media companies own vast swathes of the media, they have to compete with less news articles in the first place to be able to get people to click on their firms. But it's also a case of these companies have less of a direct reliance on ads because often, for example, private equity firms own lots of other companies that they can use to be able to run those newspaper companies in the first place. I think that means that they're more likely to have slightly more moderate political discussions, or slightly more likely to have reasonable political analysis in the first place. That means that people are likely to be better informed, and at the very least, you have less of a consistent incentive to make your news more and more sensational because you have less people to compete against in the first place. If that means that people are more informed and the quality of news is better, then that is a win for our side. The second thing to say, though, is this allows other actors to be able to influence news and to be able to influence the opinions of people in the nation. The problem is when you have lots and lots of smaller newspaper companies competing, it becomes very commonplace for you to be able to see a wide variety of news sources on your social media feeds. So that is, you might see things from The Independent, see things from The Guardian, and then see things from like 12 other news sources. The problem with this then is that you become less skeptical when you see new news sources arising on your social media feed in the first place. That is, if you're always seeing different news sources every day, then you're not going to be quite as questioning of a new news source when it pops up because you're used to that diversity. The problem with this is twofold. I think the first thing to say is that you're more likely to buy into things like fake news headlines. That is, when you're not used to only seeing 3 or 4 sources, but rather you're used to seeing 12 or 13 sources. When something with a slightly legitimate sounding like newspaper title pops up on your timeline in the first place, I think you're less likely to question why it is there in the first place, or question why this isn't coming from one of your major news sources, because you're used to getting news from that diverse range of sources. And that means you're less willing to question the things that you read in those headlines in the first place, and are less skeptical of the fact that there is fake news there in the first place. But the second thing to say is I think it opens up a lot of room for like countries like Russia to be able to influence foreign elections. That is, they already have done this in places like 2016 election in the US, or in the Brexit referendum, or even the Scottish independence referendum in 2014 in the UK. The problem is that when you have a wide variety of news sources that exist, then clearly Russia is better, like these actors are better able to promote smaller newspapers that aren't actually very legitimate newspapers to influence the things that people are seeing in the first place. I think when people are less skeptical of this is probably bad, but I'll take opening government before I move on.
Small firms can be critical of power because advertisers target people who read a specific journal and represent a certain demographic. They don't care about the critical content. However, on your side, pro-establishment CEOs have a direct influence on what these journals write.
Okay, yeah, so we'll keep coming to this, but I think the thing to note is that one, the people who provide the adverts in those journals to allow them to continue existing in the long run still have that influence on your side of the house when there are smaller newspapers. But B, I think we already engaged with this in the first minute of our speech, when we talk about the fact that people want to ensure long-term revenues. And so when they start criticizing corporations massively for the things that they are doing, they realize that more corporations who already engage in things like lobbying don't want to put adverts into that newspaper in the first place because they have been critical of them. So that's not a risk that these newspapers reasonably want to take, and so they have a low incentive to actually engage in the type of criticism that you're talking about anyway. What is the comparative here? Look, one, I think when you have bigger companies, you see news from fewer sources. If you're only ever used to seeing news from 3 different sources, when you see a source that you don't recognize, you're much more likely to be skeptical of that source in the first place. But 2, larger firms just have more capital. That means that they have more money to be able to pour into the advertising and the distribution of their news. That means that instead of having 6 or 7 different sources on your timeline, you're better able to have one company monopolizing the advertising of these companies. But the benefit of that is that you're less likely to have like lots of random sources popping up such that Russia can influence whatever you're reading with bots, but you're better able to only have like 1 or 2 reliable sources that are highly scrutinized being the things that are informing people's opinions. Very proud to oppose.
I thank the speaker very much for their speech, and I'm happy to call upon the proposition whip. Here.
Am I audible? Yes, so just a second. One, 2, 3. OG explained to us in a very good way why private equity have an interest to narrow down the company they own and make process more effective. OO agree that this is the interest, but argue that this effectiveness is exactly what allowed these companies to continue to exist in a tough market. What first half lacks is actually doing this weighing. Should we have less newspapers, because some of them would be closed, in order to get a better coverage? And this is something that OG doesn't do, and David does, and I'm going to explain in a clash. Second of all, we're seeing that we're going to win the clash of where do we get better coverage and win CO on their material that they add to the debate. One point of rebuttal, just about this idea that the CO says to us, we're getting a lot of resources and it makes you more skeptical. That sounds like a good thing, Eitan. We don't understand what they want us to have 1 or 2 newspapers that we trust. We want people to be skeptical about the news that they consume. Second of all, about Putin and fake news, and he's going to bribe the lower one, the smaller one. I mean, it doesn't really comparative in this debate. It's very likely that in both sides of the house, Russia will be able to buy influence and like bribe also the big newspapers, and this stays to a large extent on both sides of the house. Let's go to my substantive. First of all, first clash. the quality of coverage. Because David gives you a lot of analysis, and unfortunately, CO does not answer any of it, okay? What David gives you, one, the ability to form a specific mindset within the audience. And David gives you two mechanisms, and understand, OG already start and say they have an interest to guard their stockholders, but what David gives you is the difference between this world and the counterfactual, because interest to serve your owners is true in both sides of the house. The question is how specifically you do it when you control a lot of newspaper. And David gives you two mechanisms. One, the ability to create an illusion of discussion, okay? If I see a lot of different voices that are seemingly arguing, but basically says the same thing, so basically they argue whether or not the tax of big companies should be at 24% or 22%, we think that it looks like an argument, but it framed the entire discussion between these very marginal differences when the actual discussion should be like, should it be 30 or 50% or much lower or higher? And therefore, it's create the illusion of discussion without actually providing different views. And second of all, it can create the illusion of consent, meaning if a lot of newspapers say the same thing, as David already analyzed to you, it's a lot more convincing than if one newspaper says. So we think, and this is the first point of analysis. The second one is basically David tells you, we think that they have a strong incentive to avoid controversial issues, because notice already OO say to us why they're afraid of backlash and bad PR, but David gives you the pernicious effects it creates. One, it's a chilling effect of all coverage, okay? If I don't want to have a media backlash, because I don't want my base to ban me, then I would also do it in many of my subsections, because I don't want to cover a controversial issue in a specific place in the country, because now my base can discover it and ban everything that I do, not just this specific thing. This does not happen to a local newspaper who have no such exposure to things that happen in the rest of the country. Second of all, we think that it's very likely that big advertisers, which are the big revenue streams, can force and pressure these kind of newspapers. Okay, because we say that if a local newspaper want to cover a violation of Amazon in specific fulfillment center, we think that Amazon can now waive its vast advertising budget to the entire media body and ban this coverage altogether. They have much less leverage when it's only the local newspaper. Therefore, also on our side of the house, it's much worse. This needs to be weighed against CO that say to us there is an incentive to clickbait. We think that two things in this. One, it exists on both sides of the house, because you still need to get the reader attention against everything that happened in Facebook and cute cat videos. Okay, so we still want to have like the race to the bottom of clickbait exists on both sides of the house in a very similar way. But second of all, even if the title is bad, the coverage is still better on our side of the house because of all the things that I explained to you and CO never respond to. And therefore, if it brings more people to read it, we think it's a great thing because now they get better coverage, okay? Now so at the end of this first class, we show you why we have an interest to create a pernicious effect of silencing specific views and a very powerful mechanism to actually do it, to which we say this is already enough to win the clash of better coverage. Let's weigh this against OO case of basically economy of scale. And before that, I'll take CO.
All of your analysis is premised on all of these smaller companies existing on your side. You never show on your side what they're likely to exist in the first place, so you cannot have your...
Okay, luckily I have a second clash that does exactly that. Let's go into my analysis, okay? So basically, OO already say to us, economy of scale is important because it's hard to make money on newspaper, and therefore we need efficiency. To which we say a bunch of things. One, this is not really true in the online world. I mean, most of your analysis about distribution and printing press is not relevant when you only lend a website. Therefore, your vast majority of actually a fixed cost is significantly less in our new world. So we think that your incentive, your ability to actually be more effective is significantly less. Second of all, we think, and this is critical analysis, we think that on our side of the house, there are places in which two local newspapers exist. We think on your side of the house, what is likely to happen is the media, the big one would buy one of them, would make it little bit more efficient and therefore force the other one out of the market, because if you're a small company, you can compete with another small company, but you cannot compete with a huge conglomerate that force you out of the market. And therefore, on the house, yes, we get two newspapers that are maybe a little bit like have less money, but still most of them would still survive because the fixed costs are not that big. And on your side of the house, we get one very shallow version of it with very much interest of controlling what they say. And we think that we are much better off with having both of them. And the last point here is simply to say, we would rather have a little bit less papers, but that each and every one of them actually free to cover and bring meaningful information, than a lot of papers, but controlled by one people. Please propose whatever.
I'd like to thank the speaker very much for their speech and call upon the opposition whip to conclude the debate and the tournament as a whole, although hopefully not for some or all of you.
Hey, am I audible? It's still on 1%.
Just try using mine. Like
I don't see the numbers in yours. Okay. I'll start in 3, 2, 1. Firstly, on what the most important thing in this debate is, meaning why do people need to be informed in the first place, given that none of the other teams answered that. Then talking about which side has better quality of this kind of news, and at the end, which side is probably more accountable. Firstly, why are we even talking about this kind of news, and what is the crucial impact that we're talking about in this debate? I think that OO, for example, never tells you why investigative journalism is the most important thing in this debate. None of the teams tell you why diversity is such an important thing. We tell you that this is crucial in terms of people being informed as to what is important for them in terms of next elections, in terms of discourse between the people, but also in terms of what is crucial and the most important thing during the cycle of information and so on, what the crucial thing is. This means that any types of polarization between the people are reading different type of news in terms of like talking about what the most important things are, talking about just like about shallow things, even if people know many of them and so on, talking about Merkel or whatever. I think this is all the things that are actively harmful when people don't get informed. This is why only our team tells us that people get informed in terms of the most important issues at the point of which when you don't have huge competition on a market, only on the point of which when people want to give you actual data and actual stuff that is problematic with the society without pernicious incentives, only in those cases can you actually benefit to the people. This is why I think we are the only teams who can guarantee the people that they're actually being informed with the truth and are not swayed in terms of any type of biases and stuff like that. Firstly, in terms of when they talk about which side is more likely to actually deliver you the news that is the most important to you, note that government side, both of the teams would firstly need to prove to you, one, that these firms would exist in the first place, like media houses, but secondly, that they have enough of the money to do all of this kind of stuff that they claim. Any type of diversity, you need a lot of resources for it. Any type of any types of investigations and stuff like that, you need resources for all of that. They never managed to prove to you, but they're able to do this kind of stuff on their side. This is why I think all of their impacts are marginal at best. They, I think, live in a fantasy world when it's unlikely that they're able to reach any type of impact on their side. On our side, not only, I think opening like to some degree like tells you there's economies of scale and so on. This is why you can investigate, but only our team tells you why there's an incentive to give you quality news as opposed to clickbaity stuff. On their side, what happens is there's maybe a lot of competition between the firms, meaning prices drive down, but also you compete in terms of stuff that's very quick, right? It's your like first page of the most important, like of the most interesting thing, I don't know, of dog doing something interesting, or just like something that is not relevant to the politics in the first place, right? On our side, given that you have less competition in the first place, the competition becomes different. The competition is about who can get into more detail, who can get better investigation, who can actually prove prove that something that bad, some corruption and stuff like that actually happened. This can only happen in a case that you actually have time to research, but also people not being afraid, and in a case that not every single person reads this kind of stuff, is actually interested in doing this kind of stuff. This is why clickbaiting is not symmetric, because news didn't used to be like that. At a point at which when it was not so diverse, and at a point at which not every single person had their own media house that they were watching, this was exactly when you had more people actually interested in actual stories and stuff that actually benefited them. This is why I think on our side, you're only willing to call out, for example, Bezos at a point at which you can actually prove that what they did was wrong, and you can actually have a backing for all those kind of stuff. Only when you have an incentive to do this kind of stuff, when you don't have to rely on you just being clickbaity, on you being spreading any types of stuff. I think at the point at which most of the journalists in the first place want to give out this news and like really want to give people the truth and so on, right? I think it is more likely they're able to do this kind of stuff on our side. This is why I think information in overall is better on our side. Secondly, about biases, which side is more likely to have less biases in this debate? Because note that governments say it's because of diversity, you're somehow more likely to find it. OO talks about, yeah, but it's a PR hit if you're biased. I'm unsure as to why anybody in our society cares about small PR hits, about like news being to a certain degree biased. I have not seen it, I have not read about it, exactly because it's not the main source of which the news is currently important. I think that thus all of the news is probably to some degree ideological. Like you always have somebody who owns it, you always have people pushing narratives and so on. So to some degree, you always have it. The difference is, on our side, you're aware of what type of bias you have. When you read Sun, you know what the bias is. When you read Guardian, you know kind of what they're leaning towards and what their political opinions are. This is only when people are able to critically engage with this kind of stuff is when they, before they start reading, know what the bias is going to be like, and they can be more aware of it. I think only on our side happens that, because you don't have to go through all of the kind of different types of stuff. You cannot make a research on all of them, but where it's about the culture and what people tell you is likely to be biased. This is why I think you only have less biases when, yes, people are aware of it, meaning people are their accountability as opposed to other smaller media houses. But secondly, also we have big houses talking about it, right? As soon as we have more than one of these big houses, I don't know, Guardian comparing with I don't know, New York Times, for example, you can actually see them competing and showing you in detail what the differences are. I think only in the cases when you actually have big actors who can take time and actually know about all of this kind of stuff. Yeah, CG.
We showed you both incentives and ability to control public discourse in a pernicious way, which means that even if some newspaper would have to close down, at least the rest of them would be able to provide true information.
OG tells you that there's not a lot of money currently in local media houses, and I think based on that, very likely they go bankrupt on their side in the first place. At best, what they tell you is that there are new structures, which they never explain why they're likely profitable. But secondly, I also don't understand why they're likely to let somebody buy them out in the case that they're profitable in the first place. No analysis in those kind of instances. But I also think that if they want to talk about any type of donors or any types of ads that they talk about, this is exactly where the bias comes from. Exactly when it's more volatile, meaning somebody doesn't own you, but rather you're reliable on how people feel like in that very month when you're raising more donors or whatever. This is when they're going to influence you to a much greater extent. This is when they'll tell you you cannot tell this story because we will not sponsor you anymore. I think much more likely happens when you don't have somebody who owns you, and no matter what the type of news that you're putting out, they're likely to be there because like they're dependent on the profit of your news in the first place. I think much more likely that you have this kind of stuff on our side. Lastly, about fake news, not responded to at all. We tell you that only in the cases where you're not comfortable in where you are in terms of like how much profits you have, how much you're able to like stand up to other forces. I think much more likely that there's more subversion of fake news. You need it sometimes exactly because you need to be a clickbaity and you need more people to read you in the first place. But I also think that you're more open to it at a point of which is the only way in which you can be funded in the first place. I think Bloomberg, for example, is never going to be open to another force influencing their news and thus swaying it into whichever way possible. I think Kazakhstan is exactly the example when you don't have the accountability, exactly because when big force is trying to influence you. I think that you have more objective news and more diverse news on our side, and this is crucial for the people to be able to vote normally. Those reasons, CEO.
I thank the speaker very much